I'm fine, thank you.
Good
Okay,
evening,
we
sir.
are
Niladri,
live
sir.
Good
now.
evening. Very nice to meet you, Sourav, Protim. Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too,
Thank you.
sir.
Okay, so we are live now. Good evening, everyone. This is Soumi Ganguly, and I welcome you to today's digital discussion. This session is a part of our larger project called Forced Migration under TMYS Review March 2022, that's up and running in collaboration with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. Under this theme of forced migration, we are currently calling for submissions in the form of essays, stories, and poems. To know more about the project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists. The topic of today's discussion is Have Men Really Come Home? And to share their thoughts, we have with us Dr. Niladri R Chatterjee, Dr. Sourav Banerjee, and Dr. Pratim Sharma. They are all experts in this area with many years of professional and academic experience. But before engaging with them in this discussion, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers to our audience here tonight. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Sourav Banerjee, who is an associate professor and head of the Department of English at a government-sponsored college affiliated to the Calcutta University. He has over 2 decades of teaching experience and a PhD in Australian literature. He is currently an ambassador of International Organization of Educators and Researchers Incorporated Philippines. He is an advisory board member of the book series titled Post-Humanities and Citizenship Futures of Rowman and Littlefield and a couple of other reputed journals. He has published widely in national and international journals and has also delivered keynote addresses and invited talks in India and abroad. His areas of interests include post-colonialism, post-humanism, Shakespearean dramas, gender and cultural studies, popular literature, and mythology. Our second speaker in today's discussion is Dr. Protim Sharma, who is an associate professor and head in the Department of English at Dikhomukh College, Sivasagar, Assam. He holds a PhD in Organizational Studies from Dibrugarh University and postgraduate diplomas in the teaching of English from EFL University and journalism Mass Communication from Assam Professional Academy. His research interests include language and culture, English language teaching, organizational communication, media studies, identity, migration, and ethnicity. He has been published in various books and journals and invited as guest speaker in academic institutions, including one at the Centre for South Asian Studies, University of Edinburgh recently, where he spoke on identity consciousness and the issue of immigration in Assam, India. Dr. Sharma is an editor, language consultant, and an approved language specialist for aviation English for the Airports Authority of India and has been writing in the popular language column titled Mind Your English in the Assam Tribune since 1997. Our third speaker tonight is Dr. Niladri R Chatterjee, who is professor, Department of English at University of Kalyani, West Bengal. His doctoral work was on the novelist Christopher Isherwood, a recipient of the Fulbright Scholarship and the British Council Charles Wallace Fellowship. Professor Chatterjee has co-edited The Muffled Herd, Stories of the Disempowered Male, Nari Bhav, Androgyny and Female Impersonation in India, authored a novel called The Scholar, and contributed to the American Isherwood, American Notes and Queries, among many other journals of international repute. He was also a member of the editorial board of the aforementioned ANQ. Along with teaching a course in gender studies at his university since 2009, he served as a visiting faculty at the Department of English, North Bengal University in March 2011. Dr. Chatterjee also runs a Facebook group called New Gender Studies and has started posting videos on his YouTube channel recently. Now we would move on to engaging with our speakers and hearing their perspectives on today's topic. Our first speaker is Dr. Banerjee. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shomi. Thank you for this your kind words in introducing me, and I am really privileged to be in such august company. I hope my voice is coming through clear.
Yes, it's clear.
Oh, okay. Right. So let me dive deep into the topic. So since today's session is under the sub-theme of pandemic, under the broader theme of forced migration, I thought that I'll try to explore to what extent both physically and psychologically, men have come back home just prior to, during, and after the pandemic. I'm calling it after the pandemic because I'm hoping that we are in the last stages of this pandemic and it's going to get over very soon. So the topic for the session today is, have men really come home? And I don't know, Shomi, how much my perspective will help your cause, but this is what I intend to do today. And instead of starting to look at it from the question of if men have really come home, I'd rather take a step back and start with the question of whether men ever really wanted to come back home. And I'm not talking necessarily in relation to the pandemic. The first thing that comes to my mind, since I am a student of English literature, is a wonderful poem by the pioneering metaphysical poet John Donne called A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, where he compares the souls of the lovers to a compass, where the fixed leg is that of the lady love and the roaming leg is that of the man. And the metaphysical argument is that though the man keeps roaming around, he is actually connected to his home or partner through his soul, just like the legs of a compass are connected to each other at the top, despite the fact that one is fixed and the other keeps roaming around. And this is not really a one-off example. In literature, we have an abundance of this, right from the days of Beowulf, the Wanderer, the Seafarer, to the medieval and the Arthurian romances, and even in Tennyson's poem Ulysses, the role and fulfillment of a man's life seems to have been in his quest, which may be of anything, but definitely has to be outside his home. So what I'm arguing is that even in the modern times, a man's natural propensity, whether he is living away in another place, away from his home, or working in his hometown, is to be the roaming leg of the campus. But the lockdown during the pandemic had forced him to return home and even stay indoors 24/7, which was definitely curbing his natural spirit. Now, under this scenario, I will consider how this coming home, we cannot call it homecoming, this coming home has been and what it has entailed. So, now the scenario of the home after the COVID-19 induced lockdown was an unfamiliar place for the man. Not that even without the lockdown, he was too familiar with what is going on. But after this lockdown, it became an even more unfamiliar place where he had to spend 24 hours of the day, 7 days a week. So, and this home entailed an increased amount of domestic chores and domestic care needs. With a plethora of workload that possibly could not have been outsourced, especially during the full lockdown, for obviously, as we know, the fear of the risk of bringing infection into the home, many people confined to their homes have had to double up as teachers, nurses, childcare personnel, domestic help, laundry person, and even cooks, and so many other things. But the question is, how much have the men helped in these ways? The fear had always been that women may have been shouldering a greater burden, even at the cost of peace and well-being. But the real frightening fact, however, I'd say, is that until now, this fear, which was founded on an ad hoc account or on ad hoc accounts and stereotypes rather than on hard evidence, has been validated by a host of surveys. Now, according to the UN Women Rapid Assessment Survey conducted in 2020, the evidence becomes crystal clear. The COVID-19 crisis affected women's and men's time differently. Besides the already larger domestic burden for women prior to the pandemic, irrespective of the fact of whether they were working women or not, they had to spend even more time on these chores during the pandemic. I'd say the physical coming home of the men folk have not exactly translated into a celebration or a helping hand for the women of the house. except perhaps for the initial euphoria of getting the company of their husbands or partners the whole day long, which was not possible before the pandemic lockdown. It is not exactly, or it was not exactly, a very happy situation for the women. Women are doing significantly more domestic chores and family care because of the impact of the pandemic, and it is, I would say, not only the additional chores but something more. According to new global data from UN Women, it suggests that the coronavirus pandemic could wipe out 25 years of increasing gender equality. And to quote the UN Women Deputy Executive Director Anita Bhatia, let me quote, everything we worked for that has taken 25 years could be lost in a year, unquote. So employment and education opportunities could be lost, and women may suffer from poorer mental and physical health. Even before the pandemic, it was estimated that women were doing about three-quarters of the 16 billion hours of unpaid work that are done each day around the world. And this has only gone up drastically after the pandemic, with the additional domestic burden, posing a real risk of reinforcing gender stereotypes. And this added domestic chores is only one part of the story. The second, and the even more alarming fact, is that because of this coming home of men and the increase of domestic chores resulting from it, many women are actually not going back to work. Since I would argue that most women were working in the non-formal sectors and were in temporary employment. Of course, I am oversimplifying, but we have to do this for the sake of this project. In temporary employment, as I said, and the coming home of the men of the house, so as to say, has forced them to sacrifice their job and stay back home. According to, again, the UN Women, in the month of September 2020 alone, in the US, something like 8,65,000 women dropped out of the labor force compared to only 2 lakh men. And most of that can be explained by the fact that there was too much more at home to do, with not too many people helping, despite the men having come back home. Now, UN Women warns that the ripple effect from having fewer working women will be dire, not only on the women's well-being, but on their economic progress and independence as well. I do not have the exact figures for India, but by virtue of teaching in a college which is a little off the city, it is not inside the city proper, I know from personal experience and from personal interactions how this coming home of men in the household of my students had affected the women. So let me share a few things with you. With the fathers and the other men folk being away, my students have told me that the daughters and the sons were not discriminated by their mothers, but in the presence of the fathers and under their explicit instructions, the sons are now getting extra privileges. So one of my female students had said, now we have started working, we have started going to the college, so classes are on an offline mode. So I was interacting with the students. So one of my female students had said that earlier her mother would divide and share a boiled egg between her brother and herself. But after her father had returned home from Surat, where he would be working before the pandemic, he had instructed her mother to give the whole egg to the son. Now, that is very sad. Not only this, many of my other female students have said, and I'm sure that most of the teachers have experienced this, that their fathers had also, taking into consideration the availability of only one cell phone and limited data pack, only one cell phone in the family and limited data pack, instructed that only the son should be attending online classes and the daughter should be doing the household chores. And my female students very strongly believe that this would not have happened if their fathers were not home all the time. And now I'll come to the third and the final thing that I wish to mention here today, and that is about what has happened when men have come home. the question of the spike in domestic violence. Now, violence against women tends to rise in any emergency. It increases in any emergency, including epidemics. Stress, disruption of social and protective networks, increased economic hardships, and decreased access to service can aggravate the risk of women suffering violence. And in the case of COVID-19 isolation, restricted movement and stay-at-home measures to contain the spread of the infection have had a particularly acute impact on women, if I may say so. The chances of women and their children being exposed to violence has dramatically increased as family members spend more time in close contact and household stress intensifies, and the risk grows even greater when families also have to cope with potential economic or job losses. I will not go into further details on this over here, maybe later in the session if the opportunity arises. So, when people try to be cheerful about social distancing and working from home, citing that even William Shakespeare and Isaac Newton did some of their best work while England was ravaged by the plague, all I can say is that, remember, neither of them had domestic responsibility. Shakespeare spent most of his career in London, where the theatres were, while his family lived in Stratford upon Avon. During the plague of 1606, the playwright was lucky to be spared from the epidemic. His landlady actually died at the height of the outbreak, and his wife and two adult daughters stayed safely in the Warwickshire countryside. Newton, meanwhile, had never married or had children. He saw out the Great Plague of 1665-66 on his family's estate in the east of England and spent most of his adult life as a fellow at Cambridge University, where his meals and housekeeping were provided by the college. So for those who share the burden of domestic responsibilities, an infectious disease outbreak is unlikely to give them time to write a King Lear or develop a theory of optics. A pandemic magnifies all existing inequalities. Working from home in a white-collar job is always easy. Employees with salaries and benefits will be better protected. Self-isolation is less taxing in a spacious house than a cramped apartment or even in a place like Dharavi. But one of the most striking effects of the coronavirus is that it has caused a huge setback for the women. Across the world, women's independence has become a silent victim of the pandemic. In her book Invisible Women, Caroline Perez notes that 29 million papers were published in more than 15,000 peer-reviewed journals around the time of the Zika and the Ebola epidemics. But only less than 1% of those explored the gendered impact of the outbreak. And I fear that despite the flurry of seminars, conferences, symposia, and debates that are being organized and papers being published on the coronavirus, history may get repeated with respect to leaving out the women and celebrating men's coming home. So I wind up here by saying that I do not really know if after all this we can say that men have actually come home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving us your insightful opinions of on this topic, for discussing men and the concept of home, throwing light on the familiar trajectory of men journeying out of home and how women have always been tied to the idea of domesticity that underpins gender inequalities and something that is made even more glaring post-pandemic. Thank you very much for this, sir. And now we would move on to our next speaker. Over to you, Dr. Sharma. Sir, you are muted. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you are muted.
I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. I think I'm audible now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Soumi, for having me in this distinguished panel. Talking about the theme, have men really come home in the backdrop of the pandemic, and taking a cue from what Dr. Sourav has just said, I'd like to focus mostly on the phenomenon of working from home, especially by the men folk. Okay, I would say that the pandemic has brought about it's a paradigm shift in many aspects in our lives and lives and work. Okay, many individuals, especially the men, who have had to come back home leaving their profession due to the nationwide lockdown, they have experienced post-traumatic stress. They've experienced anxiety, had depression symptoms, sleep problems or adjustment disorder. And one of the biggest challenges of the pandemic, this adaptation process, has been the switch to working from home. The COVID-19 restrictions have forced us to adopt the new normal. And as I told you, one of the most adaptation measures has been working from home, if not working at home, but from home. And working from home has been one of the most important and visible changes during the pandemic. This working from home has its own challenges and concerns. Um, it is crucial to develop and implement best practices for working from home to maintain a good level of productivity, achieve the right level of work and life balance, and maintain a good level of physical and mental health. These lockdowns, stay-home calls, or physical distancing have had the significant impact on our daily lives, from work to traveling, from school offices to home, um, and to our social life, and many more. So, work from home, uh, it has changed to, as I mentioned, work at home in no time. We have seen that memes going give way to actually, breaking the stereotype, with more men doing more homework. I mean, household work. They have experimented with fusion cooking. They still cook breakfast on weekends, like I also do, and they may be, pursuing some hobbies, some long forgotten hobbies. Uh, And I'd like to here mention a survey conducted by Avatar. It's a diversity and inclusion strategy firm in collaboration with National Human Resource Development Network. Uh, it's called the Core Division and Dynamics at Indian Homes uh, during COVID times. The report is an outcome of trying to understand how COVID-induced remote working impacted the narrative of core division in Indian homes. Some very progressive discoveries have come out. Is that out of the 300 plus professionals surveyed, 35% of men said that their contribution to household chores, like cooking, cleaning, caring, has increased substantially during the COVID-induced lockdown period. Uh, and 31% of the young generation men, they reported they have equal load sharing at homes. But on the flip side, while 45% of married women reported spending more than 3 hours on household chores, but only 2% of married men reported doing so. What we observe here is that we know about the glass ceiling metaphor in academics, in business, in offices, or even in homes. Now the gender roles reversed. Paradigm shift, as I told you. After men have really come home, uh, we can see the breaking the this gender roles reversed, and the other was thankless job of a woman is now being recognized, which is a positive aspect of men coming home and doing household chores. And another observation could be like this: that there is still need for greater parity at home towards societal equity and gender inclusive growth. Uh, I think on that note, I'd like to stop here, Soumi. Maybe if I'm given an opportunity later, I'll give more insight, try to give. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for discussing how this working from home situation has had debilitating effects on the mental health of people, how it has alienated individuals from the society at large. But also at the same time, I would like to point out that it was great that you threw light on the gulf that continues to exist between the concepts of working from home and working at home. Thank you very much, sir. And I would now like to invite Dr. Chatterjee to share his opinions on today's topics. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Soumi. I have been teaching a course in gender studies since 2009. And so, a very important part of the gender studies curriculum right from the beginning was to also focus on masculinity. So I included a section on masculinity fairly early. Most campuses, when they teach gender studies, it effectively becomes about women. It sometimes becomes exclusively about cis women and about heterosexual women. So therefore, even in gender studies courses, there is a very narrow area which is very often mined, but so therefore other genders are left out. So what I'm going to do right now, and I'm not going to take much time, I will broadly talk a little bit about the way in which masculinity has been theorized, and then try to understand how that theorization perhaps would help us to try and understand exactly what is happening to masculinity during the pandemic, during the lockdown. Now, R.W. Connell, who is one of the most important contributors to the theorization of masculinity studies, an Australian. Um, sorry. So R.W. Connell started off life as a man, but has since transitioned. So Robert Connell is now Raywin Connell. So I shall be referring to R.W. Connell henceforth by using the pronoun she. Now, what she did was she developed a way of theorizing masculinity, and she identified that there are broadly three kinds of masculinity. So the first kind of masculinity that she identified was hegemonic. The second was complicit, and the third was subordinate. So the hegemonic masculinity is something that most of us would immediately recognize. That is to say, a certain way of being a man, the way that is at that point in that society as being recognizes as being the ideal way to be a man. So therefore, this is what a man should be. The patriarchy loves to prescribe what correct gender performance is. So hegemonic masculinity is the correct gender performance, as it were, of masculinity. And this can change from time to time, this can change from place to place, but whichever is the supposedly accepted way to be a man, that is regarded as hegemonic masculinity. Then the second category that you have is the complicit masculinity. Men who belong to this particular category, the complicit, they perhaps don't come across overtly as being hegemonic, but they definitely benefit from the dividends that are provided by patriarchal society simply because they are men. Just by the virtue of being a man, you have access to certain privileges, and these privileges are the kind that the complicit masculine men enjoy, which leaves us with the third category, which is subordinate. This is the category of masculinity where men actually, consciously or unconsciously, they refuse or they do not conform to either the hegemonic or to complicit, which means that they are not interested in performing a kind of masculinity that is socially accepted as being masculine. And they therefore do not get any of the dividends that are normally laid at the feet of those who embody hegemonic masculinity and those who embody complicit masculinity. So these are the three broad categories that we have, the hegemonic, the complicit, and the subordinate. Now, if we actually look at the men who have come back home, I think the first thing that we probably have to keep in mind is that there are two very important caveats that perhaps need to be mentioned. First of all, men coming home, this is to a very large extent also some kind of a class phenomenon. Yeah, because you have a certain class of men who have come home. Remember that there are other men who absolutely have no luxury of working from home, because the nature of the job is such that they have to be out on the street whether they like it or not. So therefore, to a certain extent, the daily laborer, for example, or there are several other professions where men, doctors is a very, very prime example. Those who are treating COVID patients, they can't possibly treat COVID patients, from home. So therefore, there are all the men hospital staff, to talk about essential workers. They don't have the luxury of staying at home. So therefore, there is a certain percentage of men definitely went home to work from home, but not all men. So, if we look at the way in which the hegemonic men have reacted to the lockdown, this I think is absolutely in conformity with what the first presenter has said, because it is very, very clear that the hegemonic male, is first of all, he finds it very, very uncomfortable to be found at home, because the hegemonic male in his mind has consistently regarded the home or the domestic space as the feminine space. So therefore, there is a certain anxiety on the part of the hegemonic male that maybe if I find myself at home too much, I might actually lose my masculinity. I might actually lose my, maybe my testosterone level will go down, and I will gradually begin to secrete estrogen and turn into a woman. So out of this anxiety, remember, arises a kind of dissatisfaction, a kind of resentment, as it were, and as often happens, this resentment is targeted, and it is actually visited on the wife. So when we actually look at the appalling rise in domestic violence, which shot up exponentially, part of that is the fear that perhaps being at home is emasculating some men. So how do you show that you're masculine? You indulge in violence, because patriarchal society has taught men that in order to be truly a man, you have to be violent. So therefore, violence is regarded as a marker of masculinity by patriarchy. And of course, the hegemonically masculine men, they definitely resort to violence, with sometimes absolutely fatal consequences for the person on whom that violence is visited. We come to the complicit masculinity. Now, the complicit masculinity, those who embody that, they find themselves at home. They know that they are men. They are extremely conscious of their masculinity, but they also know that they have to share the household chores. They have to help out with the washing and the cooking and the cleaning. They have done that, but the anxiety that they suffer, that actually never goes away. So there is a way in which they have found a way to make peace with the new situation, but they are not entirely satisfied with it. We come to the third category of the subordinate masculinity. These are the men who are absolutely not interested in what patriarchy prescribes as masculinity. A very large percentage of subordinate masculine men, they have been doing washing and cooking and cleaning even before pandemic days. There is a very large percentage of young men, for example, who have lived away from home because they have got a job in a different in a different city or in a different country fairly early on in their career, and they were forced to learn how to cook and clean. So when they are now in a domestic sphere, they are now married with children, because they are so habituated with cooking and cleaning from many, many years, it is not actually a difficult adjustment at all, because this is something that they have been doing all along without caring for, what the society might think of them. So therefore, there are three distinct. I'm sure there are other various nuanced, complicated ways in which men have reacted to being at home, but these are perhaps the three broad categories. One category of men who have refused to share the burden, who have said that I've got far too much work, so I'm so sorry, but I won't be able to help you. A second category of men have helped, but with a great deal of resentment. The third category of men have said, no, no, absolutely, this is absolutely fine. I have done this all my life. I shall just do that, continue to do it. It's no big deal for me. So that is broadly the three kinds of masculinity. Before I finish my little contribution to the discussion, I would want to talk about a category of men that almost always becomes invisible when we talk about men, which is the trans men. And I think that any discussion regarding gender now absolutely has to include the transgender, because without which I think, in 2021, no discussion of gender is complete. In fact, by default, it becomes patriarchal. So I would wish to talk about trans men and to talk about how trans men and indeed trans women, but because this is about men, let's talk about trans men, how they have been affected by the lockdown. Well, the way in which they have been affected is that they have now been forced to gender present in a way that makes them distinctly uncomfortable. Remember, these are trans men, which means that they were gender assigned female at birth, and then but they feel like men, supposedly. So therefore, they wish to transition to becoming men. Now, many trans men are pre-op, which means that they have not undergone gender reassignment surgery. Some of them have started taking hormonal injections. Some kind of medical intervention has started, but the process is not complete. Then there are other trans men who have just begun the treatment. So the chemical change, the chemical process of the change have not actually kicked in, but they are actually undergoing psychological counseling so that the counselor can actually make sure that this is a person who is actually prepared to undertake the kind of transition that being trans requires. They have found themselves in an extremely suffocating and potentially very violent situation at home. When we talk about domestic violence during the pandemic, we usually talk about the violence that is visited on women by their husbands. What we don't talk about is the violence that is visited on LGBTQ children, very often by the father, right? So therefore, when an LGBTQ child does not have the access to their friend circle, remember that their preferred gender presentation, when I'm talking particularly about trans children, their preferred gender presentation is something that is denied to them. And because of that, they suffer a kind of psychological trauma, which is slightly different from the psychological trauma that is suffered by anybody else. Because remember, at home, they are not at home. That is broadly the point that I'm trying to make, is that at home, they are not at home. Their home is elsewhere. They feel much more comfortable when they're visiting their friends, because their friends' place, it is a safe space. There they can gender present there they want to. But because they can no longer travel to their friends' places, now what you have is that the trans men are forced to live indoors, which basically is a horrendous situation to be in, because they simply cannot be themselves. Um, I will be perfectly happy to take questions later, but I think these are my primary concerns when I am talking about how men have reacted to the lockdown. Thank you.
That was a very enriching talk. Thank you very much for discussing the constructs and categories of masculinity, holding to light the phenomenon of class in men's homecoming during the pandemic, and most importantly, how the hegemonic male has responded to this idea of coming home as if it is underpinning their castration anxiety. It is very
Mm,
true that the home is not always a place of security and comfort for non binary individuals, and this heteronormative setup is not essentially a place of comfort for them. Thank you for also talking about non-binary individuals and how trans men at various stages in their journey of transition have been impacted by this pandemic, both physically and psychologically. So, after having addressed the concept of men's homecoming from an array of perspectives, I would now like to ask our speakers some pertinent questions. Dr. Banerjee has already discussed the facts and figures pertaining to how women have had to withdraw from professional sectors post pandemic. My first question to you is, during the lockdown, we have come across many videos on the internet where men can be seen doing household chores. Do you think this is entirely tokenistic, meant only to avoid social disaffection? What are your views on this?
This is for me, Shomi.
It's
Yeah.
for you.
Okay. 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 That's a very interesting and very good question. Uh, but before that, let me tell you that there is no dearth of information today. We are bombarded with information. So much so that we can say that our Satyam eva jayate, truth alone triumphs, can now be replaced with Satyam eva jayate, data alone triumphs. You get so much of information, so much you see so much of things on the internet today that it's difficult to discern how much of it is true and how much of it is false. Now, I would also say that Descartes had once said that I think, therefore I am. Now, in this age of social media like Facebook, Insta, Twitter, Snapchat, LinkedIn, and so on and so forth, that has become uh, I am seen on social media and therefore I am. Now, to start believing everything that you see on social media would be like believing that the American dream can come true or that China is working for the benefit of all humanity in the world. So, like we always should take it with more than a pinch of salt. Now, so coming to your question, yes, men have been, I mean, we have seen videos of men doing work, but then there are two sides to it. There are two kinds of such videos. One, where the men are trying to project that they are actually helping the families in their household chores, and the other, which can be called memes, where the person is wearing a suit but drawers, and then he's imploring his boss that boss, please reopen the office. There's more work in home. Let me come to office and work. And the boss is saying, shut up. I am also washing clothes, and he is also suited, booted, and I mean in the washroom washing his clothes. So but the point is, both these kind of things, both these kind of videos, one where I am projecting that I am actually helping my family, and the one where I'm making fun of that situation, they both point to the same thing. That yes, tokenism definitely does exist. And as Professor Chatterjee had aptly said, that the hegemonic men, they are like very confused, not confused, very angry with the situation. But I would also talk of another category that is called toxic masculinity. Now, toxic masculinity is prevalent very much these days. You see any comedy show, the popular comedy shows on national television and on regional Bengali channels. The main moot point, the main point of contention is how you can insult a woman, I mean, based on her looks, her height, her sexuality, everything, insulting the in-laws, your in-laws, that's a man's in-laws. So I don't think that we can simply say that these are just these videos are there because they are tokenisms, or that nobody, just as Professor Sharma said, that yes, people do help. So I don't think it is so simple. We cannot categorize it in that way, that just because we have the videos, it is true that people are helping. And just because we do not have videos, it is not that people are not helping. So if you may allow me, let me share a joke. This is pre-pandemic. What happened was that one day, the husband stayed back home because there was some problem. And the wife said that from 6 o'clock in the morning, my husband was sitting on the sofa and I was doing all the household chores. And I thought that today he will understand the worth of unpaid labor that I put in for this household. But at the end of the day, the wife said that the husband commented, honey, I see how easily you find useless chores to keep you busy all day. toxic masculinity. So, I mean, how you take those videos is entirely up to you. There's no, I mean, nothing can be in black and white. And this is my response to your question.
Yes, sir, definitely. That is just a classic example of mansplaining, a man trying to explain a woman that what you do is not of a very good word because it's unpaid labor and it's not even recognized by the society, by the economic sectors. And so, with that, my next question to you is many men who used to walk away from the town or city, or at least left for their work every day in the morning, are now staying home for days and months on end. For many homemakers who had already been under the yoke, this has become an added burden. So, with regard to this, how has men's homecoming affected women's lives?
I think this has already been answered to a large extent. But the very interesting word that you used over here, yoke. So, I mean, obviously, since we are all from the field of English literature, I am instantly reminded of Samuel Johnson talking about the metaphysical poet, heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. So, like, and I can draw this analogy that men staying in the house 24/7 with their wives and children. If you talk about the standard male notions of masculinity, that is not something which is very natural. That is not something which is considered natural either by these men, male, or by society. So in this case, they are yoked by violence together. And when you yoke by violence together two dissimilar entities, it results in violence, it results in discord, it results in all things bad. Yes, there are exceptions, but I would say that as it was discussed, I don't remember, but even I raised the point that you cannot generalize work from home for, as I said, white collar job, a person who has 15 bedrooms, okay, a person who can afford food and who can cook up dalgona coffee at the middle of the night and post it on Facebook to show that look, I am following lockdown norms, and the person who's lost his job come back home and has to help his wife in doing so-called menial jobs, so-called feminine jobs, his reaction to his wife's pleas for help will be different from a person who is working from the comfort of his home in an AC room, doing software data collection or whatever it is. So again, I would say that, I mean, whatever the case may be, except for the IT sector, even teachers, professors, we never had the concept of work from home. Yes, we worked from home, but that was different. We prepared our lessons and we collected copies. That was entirely different scenario. So when this shift happened, for most people, this was a new experience. This was not an experience that they actually wanted. So they were yoked by violence together, and that is why the violence started. That would be my response.
Yes, having a general yes or no or white or black answer to this question will be a very reductionist point from a very reductionist point of view, because there cannot be a general answer. That will be just a sweeping generalization at the cost of ruling out many other possibilities. And we also need to factor into our discussion the phenomenon of class or maybe other factors as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Banerjee, for addressing both our questions. My next questions are to Dr. Sharma. Sir, you have already talked in length about the work from home scenario or the new normal, if I may. With regard to that, I would like to ask you that with individuals being cooped up in their houses since the last year, and it does not seem likely that this scenario is going to change anytime soon, how is this impacting people's social health, given that people are alienated from the society as a whole?
Right, Soumi. Uh, this work from home situation, uh, we can see more of this, but it was there before. Telecommuting, or you can say teleworking, was in practice in many countries, which is working from home or working remotely. But it was restricted to white collar professionals, as the other speakers have mentioned, or managers only. Um, it's like flexible work arrangements. Uh, while doing household chores, people, the main folk, uh, the social life, if you focus on the men, the social life been restricted because they have to, be always on the job, kind of. Uh, so, uh, and is taking a toll on the children when you talk of the online classes. And they're obsessed with, we know social media, as you talked about social life. We have to mention the social digital mode of communication for work or for classes, online classes for the children. And when you talk of the young ones, they're obsessed with just self-esteem, the instant gratification, so to say. They are not focused on what they have to do, because after some time, fatigue sets in. They're concerned with the more likes and loves they get on Facebook or Instagram posts. The happier they are, the more they get the likes. And the pleasure sensation, what you call the dopamine in your brain, it increases. So it's a feel-good factor for them. And the social life, of course, it suffers. It suffers from, they suffer from kind of trauma when they are being unfriended. I'm talking about the young people. Most of them, their so-called friends are, of course, not meaningful friends. There is no meaningful relationships, only superficial level, temporary kind of relationship. Digital friends, and it's highly addictive. Their lifestyle is imbalanced. We are at the dinner table with the family members, and you are texting someone who is not there. So there is addiction. There's a word called fobbing, phone snubbing. Nowadays is quite common, fobbing, and there's one FOMO, fear of missing out. So all those words have come into the dictionaries because of the revolution of social networking sites. And as I told you, they're concerned with instant gratification. They want to feel good. And as they're going through this phase, all you need to have is love, patience, satisfaction, meaningful relationships, and overcome the challenges of digital world. And they must hone their social skills. Then only I think they can have a social relationship, social life, active social life. They have to come out of the digital make-believe world. And the parents, they have a greater role to play in this respect. I think that answers your question, if not wholly.
Yes, sir, definitely, because this pandemic has severely impacted the process of socialization in children and even adults who have been cut off from their peers and acquaintances. It has been a very difficult time for them to navigate through this pandemic, and it doesn't even seem that things are going to return to normalcy very soon. My second question to you is trauma consists an integral component of forced migration for people and men, to be more specific, who have had to return from their workplaces being unemployed. How has this migration weighed them down?
Well, trauma, it consists of, for forced migration. The trauma is the natural outcome. And there's a literature of migration. I might like to refer to that. Literature of migration, the poetry of migration and exile. There is one Nigerian poet, Olu Ogwibi, where is a telling tale of their lives, the experiences. They have trauma in African countries for civil war, genocide, religious fanaticism, or other forms of violence. But here, when you're asking about forced migration, it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience for people coming back home. Trauma, some people even say that it is worse than the partition time for many. The lockdown-induced migration. Many have had to shift their profession in the wake of COVID-induced lockdown. And the social stigma and shame is another point here. Then economic hardship. I've seen people in new places, in new roles, like the neighborhood vendor taking up job as daily wage laborer. So there are many cases in point which suggest that trauma uh, after being unemployed and being displaced uh, is something which is really taking a toll on their lives, and really it is distressing. Yeah, so
Definitely, sir. The reality, if we talk about it, it's very grief and harrowing for many people, if not for all. Thank you very much, sir, for addressing these questions. And I would now like to ask Dr. Chatterjee some questions. Sir, you have already shared with us your views on various categories of masculinity and how they have been impacted by the pandemic in various degrees. My first question to you is, with men returning home from their workplaces after the pandemic hit the globe, do you think they have responded to this spatial shift positively? I do not want to generalize, but if you can discuss this question.
No, no, I think that I have already, I mean, I think Dr. Banerjee has addressed it quite sufficiently, and so have I. So just to repeat what I said, that again, one can't generalize. So there have been several kinds of men, there have been several kinds of responses. Men who, I mean, a very simple way of answering your question would be to say that men who take their masculinity very seriously, they have perhaps responded the worst. They are sort of, they're so obsessed with being men that they have simply not taken into account that, I mean, there are other things to worry about rather than their gender. Men for whom masculinity is not a big issue, they have taken to it very, very casually. I will have to say that very often, even though men themselves, some men, although they may not be so obsessed with their masculinity, but there is a way in which those surrounding them, family members, impute a kind of masculinity on them, and that becomes a little difficult. I'm so sorry, but with a bit of a blush, I'll have to tell you about an incident that in which I am afraid I'm a player. You see, what happened was during the pandemic, my sister got COVID. And then my parents both got COVID. So there are four of us, four human beings in this household. Three of them were down with COVID, and as you can imagine, the lady who comes to clean and to do the dishes and to swab the floor, she stopped coming. So there was a huge pile of dirty utensils that had been growing over several days, and nothing was being done about them. And I one day decided that this is just getting out of control, because we kept waiting for the maid and she never came. I mean, she came, but much later. And so one day I rolled up my sleeves and I thought, okay, enough is enough. I'll just sort of sit down and I'm going to get the dishes. Huge pile of dishes. Um, uh, you know, and then I finished it. And what was extraordinary is that my sister, she said that, I have all along regarded you as an academic, then as a professor, who talks about post-colonial theory and gender studies. But I realize today that not only are you an expert in gender studies, you're an expert cleaner of utensils too. So I take that as a huge badge of honor. So I said, I'm so glad. Are the cups and plates shining? She said, they're shining. They're shining. I can see my face in them. So I managed to distinguish myself as a cleaner in the house. But that is not the important thing. The important thing is that look how people around us gender us in such a way that when we do something that is somehow out of the gender conformity, it comes as a shock to them. It is a surprise to them. To me, it isn't, because when I was in America for 9 months, that's what I did. I cooked and cleaned. It wasn't a big deal for me. But those who have never seen me do it, to them it was a big surprise. So therefore, I would say that again, different men, different responses. Yeah.
Very true, sir. because every individual will have a different response to
Yes.
anything, be that
Yes.
this pandemic or any other situation. Along
Yes.
the same line, I would also want to say that acknowledging that we are all victims of gender constructs in some way or
Yes.
in some way or the
Yes.
other, we are all
Yes.
victims.
Yes.
Do you think
Patriarchy
this pan
spares no one.
true,
Patriarchy
very
spares no
true,
one. Mm, mm.
and we are all intrinsically rooted to it in some way or the other.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
uh, and so, sir, do you think this pandemic alone could compel men to deconstruct some kinds of gender roles at least, or reassess their idea of the domestic? Has it been possible for the pandemic to engender such kind of a change?
No, I think the short answer would be no. I think that those who are entrenched in their gender gender comfort, I like to call it. Those of them who are actually entrenched, it is very very difficult to push them out of their gender stereotypes and to say, please, gender is nothing. It's just a word. Don't take it so seriously. But a lot of men, unfortunately, are much more fixated on gender. This is very interesting. A lot of men are actually much more fixated on gender than women are. I have found it so very often. There are certain kinds of toxic behavior. Again, Dr. Banerjee has actually mentioned that term, which I didn't. Oh, by the way, Dr. Banerjee, toxic masculinity very much comes under hegemonic masculinity. So they are pretty much indistinguishable. I mean, if you're hegemonic, you're invariably going to be toxic, no doubt about it. So what you have is that there will be these men who are so obsessed with safeguarding their masculinity that they end up endangering their lives. Do you understand that a cousin of mine, when I asked him, why do you smoke, his very honest, I mean, God bless him, his very honest answer was, because I wanted to be seen as a man. That was his answer. So I said, first of all, I'm horrified. Secondly, thank you. Thank you for being honest. So therefore, there is a way in which men endanger their mental health and definitely their physical health in trying to conform to a certain code of masculinity. So therefore, has the pandemic somehow helped them to become, slightly less hegemonic? Again, not at all sure. I think those who were hegemonic before, perhaps their hegemonic masculinity has hardened, which is the sad thing. Those who weren't hegemonic before, they are cool because they were never stuck up on gender anyway. So I think that is what has happened. But what has definitely happened, Shomi, is that the pandemic has dramatized it. So what the pandemic has done is that it has made it very very clear that it is there. One of my favorite stories is when you're talking about how men have been confined to the home. Um, a lady was once asked by her husband that after the husband has returned. Oh, by the way, this is something that we actually didn't talk about. Married women have had this experience many for many decades of men suddenly sitting at home. Please spare a thought for those women have to deal with husbands who have just retired. Oh my God, it's awful, because it's just terrible, because suddenly these men, you see, because the men that they get their identity from the chair in which they sit in the office. Suddenly when the chair gets taken away, they don't know what to do. So I'll tell you just two stories. One is of somebody who was in the army, and so he retired from the army. And then when we went to visit him, we found him treating his wife appallingly badly. He's basically ordering his wife about. So I spoke to the lady and I said, are you sure you want to be treated like this? And she very calmly told me, he used to order people about when he was at work. Now he doesn't have work. He doesn't have tons and tons of men to order about. He now orders me. So there is a way in which he has made his home his fiefdom, where he gets to order people around. He doesn't have tens of thousands of men. He has his wife. He orders the wife. Yeah. So therefore, it hasn't changed at all. And I think that men really need to look at their masculinity a little bit more critically, because if they do that, there will be several such pandemics in the future. If we don't relinquish our gender stereotypes, men are in huge, huge trouble.
Yes, sir, definitely, because this entire concept of gender, it has a lot to do with showing oneself and being seen, how I want to be seen and how I want to present myself before others. Thank you very much for sharing those anecdotes as well, because we got to learn a lot from your experiences. And with this, we bring this session to an end. Thank you very much, panelists, for being there with us and giving us your time. Needless to mention, it was a very enriching and interesting session, and we got to learn a lot from your perspectives and opinions on this idea of homecoming during the pandemic from the vantage point of gender, to be specific. So, thanks a lot for that. Drawing
It
this
was a
session to a
pleasure. I was
close
very
here.
happy to be here.
We got to
Oh,
learn a lot from you,
so
sir. Thank you.
so glad to hear that.